My son looked me dead in the eye and said, "Stop sitting in my chair, you're just a guest here." He said it in the house I raised him in, the house with his father's ashes on the mantel. I didn't cry, I didn't yell, I just nodded like any guest would. 3 weeks later, he came home and found the locks changed. The chair was still there, but his mother and the deed were long gone. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The soft ticking of the wall clock was the only sound in the room. Late afternoon sun spilled across the hardwood floor, casting amber streaks across Helen Carver's legs as she sat curled in her favorite chair, a worn but sturdy navy recliner with delicate oak arms. A copy of The Paper Palace rested open on her lap, a half-drunk cup of tea cooling on the coaster beside her. Outside, leaves rustled faintly, the hush of autumn easing through the slightly cracked window. She didn't hear the front door open. Jake's heavy footsteps announced him a second later, thudding across the entryway like a warning. Helen didn't look up. 45 years of parenting taught her when silence was safer than pleasantries. "Seriously?" Jake's voice shot through the living room like a stone through glass. Helen blinked. "What?" "You're in my chair again." Her lips parted, confusion knitting her brows. "Your chair?" Jake dropped his gym bag with a thud, running a hand through his damp hair. "Yeah, Helen, that one. I've told you before." Helen slowly placed a bookmark between the pages, closing the novel as her pulse skipped. "Jake, this is the chair I've had since before you moved back in." "Yeah, well," he snapped, pacing past her toward the kitchen. "It's been 6 months. That's my spot now. You're always in it." The word stuck in her throat. "My spot?" Jake reappeared with a sports drink in one hand, already unscrewing the cap. "Look, I'm not trying to argue, but can you just not sit there? It's annoying. You're kind of just a guest here now anyway." Her heart stopped. The silence between them stretched too long. Jake took a drink, then shrugged, as if his words hadn't detonated something in the center of her chest. "Anyway, I've had a long day." And just like that, he walked upstairs. Doors opened, closed. Helen sat perfectly still. The chair's cushion seemed to grow stiffer beneath her. Her eyes shifted slowly around the room she'd furnished, painted, cleaned, the same walls that held decades of birthdays, quiet holidays, and grief after losing Richard. Guest? Her throat felt tight. She looked at the framed photo of her late husband on the bookshelf, his quiet, knowing smile. She wondered what he would have said, what he wouldn't have tolerated. Helen stood. The ache in her knees was sharper than usual, but she didn't reach for the cane in the corner. She walked slowly toward the hallway, each step echoing a lifetime of unspoken restraint. She didn't look back at the chair. Upstairs, Jake's television blared, some talking head yelling stats about the Broncos' defense. A drawer slammed. Helen reached her bedroom, closing the door gently behind her. The familiar scent of lavender and old wood welcomed her like a memory she hadn't earned today. She sat on the edge of the bed, clasped her hands in her lap, and stared at the floor. It wasn't just a chair, and he knew it. She could still hear his voice. "You're just a guest here." Something deep and cold slid into her gut. Not rage, not even sadness. Just a clear, terrible finality, like a page had been turned that could never be unturned. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like a stranger in your own skin. She stood once more and opened the drawer in her nightstand. Under a neatly folded stack of scarves was the deed. She slid it out, her fingers brushing the embossed seal like it was an old friend. No lien, no co-owner, just her name, and the chair was still downstairs, exactly where it had always been. She looked toward the darkened hallway, her jaw tightening as something resolute settled inside her. It wouldn't be her chair much longer. Helen sat at the kitchen table the next morning, the deed lying open in front of her like a silent witness. The paper had yellowed faintly at the edges over the years. Her name, Helen M. Carver, was printed in neat, bold type across the top. No second name, no fine print, just hers. She traced the seal with her thumb, remembering the day she and Richard signed it. He'd joked about planting a lemon tree in the backyard, said it would be their house for a long, sweet time. The tree never took root, but the house had. Until now. A loud clatter came from the living room. Jake had dropped something. Again. Lately, he moved through the house like it owed him passage. Remote left on the couch, muddy sneakers kicked off by the door. That weird blue rug in the hallway she'd tripped over twice but hadn't dared move. Helen gently folded the deed and slid it back into its folder. The truth was, she'd forgotten what it felt like to hold something that was wholly hers. Jake had moved in 6 months ago. The divorce hit him hard. At least, that's what he said the night he showed up at the door with 2 duffel bags and tired eyes. She'd let him in without a second thought. At first, it was simple. He stayed in the guest room, did his laundry, took quiet walks in the evening. He even brought her flowers once. But things shifted quickly. The framed photos of the grandkids in the hallway came down without explanation. A big screen TV appeared in the den. He'd rearranged the kitchen drawers one Saturday morning while she was out. Now she couldn't find the spatula without opening 3 cabinets first. Then came the house rules. He started keeping track of the thermostat settings, asking her to knock before entering his space. The living room, the basement, even the garage. She hadn't noticed the takeover until it was already done, like waking up in someone else's life. Later that day, Helen slipped on her gray cardigan and headed out. The chill in the air was brisk but welcome. Her feet moved on muscle memory alone. The bell above the diner's door jingled as she stepped in. "Hey, sugar," Marcy called from behind the counter. "You're early today." Helen slid into her usual booth by the window. Didn't sleep well. Marcy poured coffee without asking, setting it down with a clink. "Let me guess. Jake." Helen's tired smile barely lifted. "He thinks I'm a guest in my own home." Marcy stopped wiping the counter. "Excuse me?" Helen wrapped both hands around the mug. "He said it yesterday, out loud, like it was just true." Marcy leaned on the edge of the booth, brows climbing toward her hairline. "He paying the bills now? Buy the groceries? Hell, even mow the lawn?" Helen shook her head once. "So why's he still living there?" Marcy asked, her voice soft but slicing. Helen stared down at her coffee. A curl of steam drifted up like a ghost of something she used to feel. Habit, I guess. Guilt. Marcy didn't respond right away. She just reached over and placed a small plate on the table. 2 lemon cookies, fresh baked. "Guilt's no reason to be uncomfortable in your own damn house." Helen looked up. Marcy's eyes held no judgment, just a calm certainty that felt like oxygen. Helen nodded slowly. Outside, the clouds shifted, letting sunlight streak across the sidewalk. For a second, the light caught the window in just the right way, reflecting Helen's faint outline in the glass. She didn't quite recognize the woman looking back. She reached for her purse. "I think I need to make a call." Back home, the house felt quieter than usual, not peaceful, hollow. Helen stood in the foyer for a moment, purse still looped over her arm. Her eyes flicked to the hallway rug, the one Jake insisted on buying because the old one looked dated. She'd tripped on it again last week and hadn't said a word. She towed the corner up, folded it neatly, and set it by the hall closet. It was the first time she'd moved anything in 6 months without worrying what he'd say. She walked slowly into the den, the hum of the refrigerator a faint rhythm behind her. The sunlight had shifted across the floorboards. Her chair sat empty in the corner, like it was waiting to be claimed. But she didn't sit. Instead, she crossed to the built-in shelf where she kept the landline, tucked beside a dusty vase and an unopened jigsaw puzzle she'd meant to start last Christmas. She picked up the receiver and dialed a number she hadn't used in over a year. 2 rings, then a voice, warm and clipped, with that slight edge of wryness Helen always appreciated. "Cam Doyle speaking?" She smiled faintly. "Cam, it's Helen Carver." A pause. "Well, I'll be damned. Haven't heard your voice in a while. You still keeping that house of yours prettier than the MLS listings?" Helen chuckled softly. "It's still standing." "Good to hear. What can I do for you, Helen?" She hesitated just long enough to let the moment breathe. Hypothetically, she said, her voice as measured as a chess move, how fast could we sell a 3-bedroom in North End? Cam didn't reply right away. She could hear him shift in his chair on the other end of the line. Then, depends how motivated the seller is. Helen looked around. Jake's hoodie was draped across the back of the couch. A glass with soda rings sat on the side table. Her framed family photo had been moved to the piano bench for reasons she hadn't questioned. "I'd say I'm fairly motivated," she said, her tone calm but final. "Then we could move fast," Cam said. "Real fast if you want. You still living there full-time?" "Yes, and someone else is too." "Ah," Cam said carefully. "A guest?" "Depends who you ask." Cam let out a soft exhale. "Tell me what happened." She did. Not the whole history, not the emotions. Just the words Jake had used. Just enough for Cam to understand what he needed to. When she was done, there was a long pause. Then Cam said, "All right. Motivated it is." Helen closed her eyes, her fingers pressing lightly into the countertop. A strange sort of warmth curled in her chest. Not joy, not even relief, just motion, like the first creak of a long rusted hinge. "I can swing by tomorrow," Cam continued. "We'll do a walkthrough, get the ball rolling." "Tomorrow's perfect," she said. "Need me to be discreet?" "Yes." "Done." They said their goodbyes. Helen hung up the receiver slowly, her hand lingering on it for a beat longer than necessary. Outside, the wind picked up. A few leaves danced down the driveway and caught in the edge of the gutter. She walked over to the window, watching them tumble. From the hallway, Jake's voice echoed faintly, on a call, laughing at something. Probably one of his old college buddies, probably talking about plans for the weekend, probably not wondering where she'd gone or who she might have been speaking to. Helen didn't move. She just stood at the window, her reflection barely visible in the glass, and whispered to herself, not quite smiling, "He won't see this coming." Cam arrived exactly at 9 a.m., just as Helen had requested. He parked 2 houses down and walked up the driveway with the easy, quiet confidence of someone who'd sold every kind of property Boise had to offer. He wore his usual uniform, clean jeans, a crisp button-down, and scuffed boots that somehow still looked professional. Helen opened the door before he could knock. "Coffee's on," she said. "I like a woman who's efficient." Cam grinned, stepping inside. He scanned the front room with a practiced eye. "Still looks good in here," he said, nodding toward the hardwood floors. "You've kept it up." Helen gave a soft shrug. "I tried." Cam pulled a notepad from his back pocket. "Let's start the walkthrough." They moved from room to room, his pen scratching quickly as Helen pointed out small issues. Loose knob on the linen closet, the light fixture in hallway that flickered sometimes when it rained. "All easy stuff," he said. "You're not dealing with a fixer-upper here. It's got bones. It's got story." He paused in the kitchen, turning toward her. "You still have that built-in breakfast nook?" Helen smiled faintly. "Still there, and still the only place the sun hits before 9. Cam jotted another note, then glanced toward the back door. "The yard still tidy?" "Mostly. Jake was supposed to power wash the patio last month, but..." She trailed off. "Ah," Cam said, letting the silence speak for them both. Helen poured him coffee while he laid out a single glossy folder on the table. "This is the listing prep kit," he said. "Photos, staging, disclosure forms. I can get a photographer in this week. This market is nuts right now. You list this by Sunday, it could be under contract by Monday." Helen's fingers brushed the edge of the brochure. A photograph of a sunlit living room smiled up at her. It wasn't hers, but it could be. She nodded. "That soon?" "Buyers are crawling over each other for anything clean and within 10 minutes of downtown. 3-bed, 2-bath in North End." He gave her a sideways look. "We'll need a velvet rope." She didn't smile, just tucked the brochure between the pages of a cookbook on the shelf behind her. Cam noticed but didn't comment. "Smart," he said instead, his voice low. "He doesn't read cookbooks, does he?" Helen gave a soft huff. "He barely reads mail with his own name on it." Cam took a final look around. We can stage it using what's already here. It's got charm. Doesn't need much. She nodded again. Just then, the front door opened with a click. Jake's voice drifted in before his body did, half laughing, phone pressed to his ear. Yeah. I'll send the draft later, man. I just came home to grab a... He froze mid-sentence when he spotted Cam in the kitchen. Helen turned slowly, her face unreadable. Jake, this is Cam, old friend. Cam smiled, professional and neutral. Nice to meet you. Jake gave a half wave, clearly annoyed. Yeah, sure. Helen, you got the keys to the garage? I left my laptop bag out there. In the drawer by the pantry, she said calmly. Jake barely looked at her as he passed through the kitchen, muttering into his phone again. Yeah, sorry, some guy's here. My mom's realtor or something. Helen's eyes flicked toward Cam. Cam arched a brow but said nothing. Jake disappeared down the hall, footsteps fading. Helen stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped around her mug, staring at the space he'd just walked through. Cam took a slow sip of coffee, then leaned in, voice low. You sure you're ready for this? Helen looked up at him, steady and cool. I was ready the moment he called me a guest. Cam nodded. Then let's get to work. Sunday morning arrived clean and crisp. Helen stood at the kitchen counter in a pressed blouse and gray slacks, the same outfit she'd worn to Richard's retirement party years ago. It still fit, though looser now. Everything felt looser lately, like her grip on obligation had finally relaxed. The seller's agreement sat neatly on the table beside a vase of clipped mums. Cam slid the final page toward her, pen uncapped. You ready? He asked gently. Helen didn't hesitate. She signed with a firm stroke, then capped the pen and handed it back like she was clocking out of a long, thankless job. Cam smiled. Photos go live this afternoon. I had the photographer batch them early. House looks fantastic. Helen poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed him one. Thank you, she said simply. Cam lifted the mug in a small toast. To decisive women and quiet exits. Helen almost smiled. By noon, Cam was gone, and the house was once again still. Helen refreshed the listing on her laptop and watched her living room flicker onto the screen. Warm, clean, impossibly inviting. It didn't look like a place where someone had been disrespected. It looked like a fresh start. Upstairs, Jake's door was closed. He hadn't noticed the photographer the day before. He'd been at the gym, then out with friends. The open house was scheduled for Tuesday, the offer window already shrinking. Helen checked the hotel reservation again. 2 weeks at a boutique suite near downtown. Quiet, with a kitchenette and mountain views. Paid in full. She moved slowly through the house, pulling the essentials. 2 cardigans, jeans, her laptop, a novel she hadn't touched since March. A framed photo of the kids from when they were still sweet, still hers. She folded it all neatly into a soft canvas overnight bag, careful not to disturb the staging. In the hallway, Jake's football jersey lay draped over the railing. She stepped around it without a glance. The sound of a game echoed faintly from his phone speaker. Jake was out, some bar downtown with TVs on every wall, his voice probably rising with every touchdown like the world was his again. Helen opened the hall closet and pulled down the suitcase Cam had helped her discreetly stage for packing. But for now, she only needed the small bag. She walked it to the front door and paused. A breeze caught the curtains in the living room. The house smelled like lemon oil and lavender, clean, uncluttered, as if it knew it was ready for something new. Helen knelt slowly and opened the bottom drawer of the side table. She took out a pale blue envelope marked Important Documents and slipped it into her purse. Deed, social security cards, banking passwords. The chair still sat in its corner, sun falling across the back cushion like a final benediction. She didn't say goodbye to it. At the door, she glanced back one last time. The silence didn't press against her now, it simply allowed her to breathe. She stepped outside. The bag went into the trunk with a satisfying thump. The hotel confirmation sat in the glove box, along with her old keys, now tagged with a post-it. Hand off to Cam. Friday. Helen eased behind the wheel, turned the ignition, and let the engine hum for a moment before pulling out. Across town, Jake leaned back in a bar booth, yelling at a screen while buffalo sauce stained his sleeves. He would post a picture later, him and his buddies grinning beneath a flat screen that wasn't his, captioned, "My place, my rules." Helen didn't check social media anymore. She only glanced in the rearview mirror once, and not for long. Helen returned to the house early Monday morning, just after Jake left for work. She waited in the car until she saw his SUV pull away, tailpipe sputtering as it took the corner too fast. He didn't see her parked 2 blocks over, didn't notice the dull sedan following from the opposite side. She unlocked the front door with smooth familiarity. The air smelled like lemon polish and winter creeping in through the vents. By 9:30, Stan arrived, just like he'd promised. He stepped out of the old white box truck in worn work boots and a Boise Hawks cap. He didn't say much, just tipped his head and offered her a quiet, reassuring nod. "I brought 2 guys," he said. "They know to keep it quiet." Helen nodded, grateful. No boxes with labels, no talking upstairs, just what we planned. They started in the master bedroom. Helen had already set aside what mattered. She moved through the house like a curator in her own museum, touching only what had meaning: her wedding album, the Afghan her mother crocheted in 1964, a cast-iron skillet, 3 favorite books. The rest could stay or go. It didn't matter anymore. Downstairs, Stan supervised the loading. They wrapped her bedroom furniture in thick canvas and used cloth bins for the smaller items. No screeching tape guns, no cardboard towers. If Jake came home early, he'd think they were fixing the furnace. The chair remained untouched. It sat in the corner of the staged living room, framed by clean lines and perfect lighting. Cam had insisted it stay. It added texture, he said. But Helen hadn't fought him. The chair no longer felt like an extension of her. It was now just a fixture, one Jake had laid claim to. Let him have it. By lunchtime, most of the important pieces were in the truck, tucked in layers of silence. Helen stood in the doorway, scanning the stripped-down spaces. It was still her house, but it no longer held her hostage. Jake returned later than usual, slamming the door behind him, Bluetooth headset still wedged in his ear. "Day from hell," he muttered, dropping his keys onto the entry table with a metallic clatter. "I swear, if Jerry reschedules the pitch meeting again, I'm gonna walk." Helen looked up from the newspaper, her expression unreadable. "That bad?" Jake threw himself onto the couch, then froze when he noticed a corner of the bookshelf looked slightly different. "Did you move something in here?" "No." He stared for a moment, like he was trying to remember what had changed. Eventually, he gave up and grabbed the remote. "Whatever, I'm starving. Is there anything to eat?" "There's chicken in the fridge," Helen said, folding the newspaper neatly and setting it aside. "And the couscous you like." Jake muttered thanks but didn't make eye contact. His phone buzzed again. Another crisis. Another monologue. He disappeared into the kitchen, griping about deadlines and incompetent coworkers. Helen sat quietly, her hands folded, letting him rant without interruption. She didn't owe him any more emotional labor. Not tonight, not ever again. At 7:15, Cam texted, "Friday, 10 a.m., closing confirmed. Buyer excited. Ready for keys." Helen stared at the screen for a long beat before typing back, "Perfect, we'll be out." She set the phone down gently, smoothed the hem of her cardigan, and looked around. Jake was in the kitchen now, microwaving leftovers like nothing was coming. The house looked the same, but it was hollowed out, like a stage waiting for the final scene. The only thing left to pack was the part she would never carry: the years. The house smelled like barbecue rub and stale hops by the time the second knock came. Jake, still dressed in joggers and a stained CSU sweatshirt, moved with the kind of swagger that suggested he'd earned the evening. He threw open the front door with one hand while sipping a beer with the other, greeting his friends with the forced enthusiasm of a man desperate to perform ease. "Boys!" he barked, stepping aside as 2 of them entered with a cheap cooler, clinking full of bottles and a grocery bag full of kettle chips and red Solo cups. "Hope you're ready to lose money and your dignity." The living room was exactly as he wanted it, open, clean, and perfectly arranged. He hadn't questioned why it felt so spacious lately or why the bookshelf seemed oddly sparse. In fact, he was beginning to like the uncluttered look. It made the place feel masculine, minimal, like something out of a streaming service bachelor drama. He flopped into the recliner, his recliner, and kicked his feet up onto the edge of the coffee table, just barely missing the bowl of mixed nuts he'd dumped out earlier. He didn't notice how the legs creaked under the sudden weight. He didn't care. Across town, Helen lay fully clothed atop a stiff motel bedspread in a modest room tucked behind a shuttered gas station. She hadn't chosen this place for comfort. She'd chosen it for invisibility. The motel room was clean but characterless. Thin beige curtains, a bulky TV bolted to the dresser, and a half-hearted floral painting hung crooked on the wall. Her bag sat unopened in the corner. She didn't need much. She'd brought a book, a sweater, and her phone charger. Everything else could wait until Friday. She checked her messages out of habit, then set the phone face down beside her. In the living room, Jake dealt cards with too much flourish, making a mess of the poker chips in the center of the table. Music buzzed from a Bluetooth speaker on the windowsill. Classic rock shuffled with alt radio hits from a decade ago. "So it's just you now?" one of his friends asked, nodding around the house between swigs of IPA. "What happened to your mom?" Jake barely looked up from his cards. "She's been staying at a friend's," he said with a shrug. "I pretty much have the place to myself. Kind of ideal, honestly." "Damn," someone else muttered, impressed. Jake grinned as he reached for his phone. He turned it toward the group and snapped a quick photo, just enough of the room behind him, the chips in mid-play, the perfectly arranged furniture in the frame. He opened Instagram and typed a caption with one thumb, his beer balanced on his knee. "My place, my rules, post sent, phone face down. No second thoughts?" At the motel, Helen's phone vibrated softly against the bedspread. She picked it up and blinked at the screen. One unread message from Rachel. Rachel Carver. "Just saw Jake's post. Is he living with you again?" Helen stared at the message for a moment, rereading it. She could picture Rachel's face even now, eyebrow arched, voice polite but weighted with a skepticism that had become second nature to her during the divorce. Helen typed back slowly, each word selected like a pin in a final seam. Helen Carver. Not for much longer. She set the phone down and exhaled through her nose, not out of frustration or exhaustion, but something closer to calm. There was nothing left to react to now. The pieces had already moved, the documents were drafted. Cam would text her tomorrow with the final signing appointment. After that, the walls would no longer echo with Jake's entitlement, his noise, or his performance of control. She rose and crossed to the window. Beyond the parking lot, headlights flashed intermittently along the road as cars passed without slowing. The city was still awake, but here, in this room, everything was still and silent, and no one was asking for anything. Jake hadn't noticed she was gone. He hadn't wondered where she'd gone. But by the time he did, she'd already be done. She pulled the curtain closed and turned off the light. The waiting area at the law office smelled like wood polish and legal paper, somewhere between a bank and a library. Helen arrived 5 minutes early, as she always did, clutching her purse like it was part of her posture. Her coat still held the faint scent of last night's motel room. Dry heat, old air conditioning, maybe a trace of lemon disinfectant from the hall. Cam was already there, seated near a window that overlooked a dull stretch of downtown Boise. His suit was slightly wrinkled, but his energy was crisp. When he saw her, he stood and gave a small, respectful smile. No jokes, no small talk. "Morning," he said simply. Helen nodded. "Let's do this." They were ushered into a small glass-walled conference room where a young paralegal in a blazer far too stiff for her age offered them bottled water and slid a neat stack of papers across the table. She spoke softly, like the room had a sacred function. "Here are the closing documents for the property transfer, Ms. Carver. Just a few signatures on the tabs and then I'll notarize." Helen took the pen Cam handed her, then looked down at the first page. The address stared back at her like a clean line in the sand. Her hand didn't shake, but she paused, not from doubt, not even from reflection, just a moment to acknowledge it. This was it. No fanfare, no drama, just ink, and then silence. She signed. And again. And once more. Each signature felt lighter, not triumphant, just weightless. Cam flipped the stack slowly, double-checking each field before nodding. Buyers cleared the wire. Title will transfer by noon. You are, as of 10 minutes from now, a free woman. Helen exhaled through her nose, a small sound somewhere between a sigh and a hum. And the buyer? She asked. Local couple. Just moved up from Twin Falls. 2 kids. They love the staging. You wouldn't believe how much they loved that chair. Said it made the room feel like it had history. He chuckled, then added, They're planning to repaint Monday. Move in Tuesday. Helen smiled faintly. Good. Let it be theirs. Cam slipped a narrow gift bag from beneath the table and handed it to her without ceremony. From me? Congratulations. She peeked inside, a cold bottle of California sparkling rosé, tastefully wrapped in a white linen napkin. Better than flowers, he said. Helen tucked it under her arm as they walked out into the morning sunlight. It was bright without warmth, the kind of November day that looked like spring until you stepped outside. They parted outside the building, Cam heading off to another listing appointment, Helen walking slowly to her car. The parking lot was only half full, quiet except for the hum of distant traffic. She drove without music, windows up, heater low. 15 minutes later, she stood at the front desk of the boutique hotel she'd booked 3 days ago. A young man in a green vest welcomed her by name, slid a room key across the counter and said breakfast ran until 10. Helen thanked him and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The room was small but elegant. A soft, gray color palette, high thread count linens, and a reading lamp already turned on beside a deep armchair that looked like it belonged in a catalog. She set her bag down gently, removed the bottle from the gift bag, and placed it in the small fridge near the window. Then she walked to the bathroom, washed her hands, and caught her reflection in the mirror, hair gently curled, lipstick subtle, eyes wide open. She looked at herself for a long moment, not as a guest, not as a mother, just a woman standing in her own space. She reached for one of the hotel's etched glasses, poured a generous splash of rosé, and held it up. Not high, not performative, just deliberate. To guests, she said softly, her voice steady. She sipped, then set the glass down and reached for her phone. It was time to forward the mail. By the time the locksmith pulled into the North End driveway, the wind had picked up. It was just after 9 a.m. Monday morning. The yellow maple out front was nearly stripped bare, its last leaves spinning across the lawn like dancers who'd missed their cue. The truck idled quietly as a man in a brown hoodie and navy work pants stepped out, tool bag in hand. The couple, Melissa and Derek, stood on the porch with coffee and travel mugs and matching nervous smiles. She held the keys Cam had handed them at closing. He nodded toward the door like it was a barrier they couldn't quite believe was theirs. Take your time, Melissa said to the locksmith. No rush. But of course there was. 10 minutes later, the locks were changed. The deadbolt clicked with a sound that echoed through the bones of the house like a final note. By noon, the old key in Jake's palm felt cold and absurd. He stood on the porch, shifting from one foot to the other, as if waiting would change something. The key had worked 2 days ago. Why wouldn't it now? He jiggled it again, harder, then knocked. No answer. He leaned in and rang the bell. Still nothing. Frowning, he pulled out his phone and dialed Helen. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. Mom? He said, keeping his voice just this side of annoyed. Are you home? The lock isn't working. I'm standing here with my laptop bag and just call me, okay? He hung up, tried the key once more out of pure denial, and finally stepped back from the door. The curtains inside were drawn. The porch lights were off. It wasn't just locked. It was lived in. He stood there a long moment, staring at the door like it might blink first. Then the front window moved. A woman appeared, maybe mid-30s with dark-rimmed glasses and a kind of puzzled smile. She stared at him through the glass like she might at a mailman who hadn't moved on. Jake stepped forward, raising a hand in apology. Hi, I'm not sure what's going on. I live here. Well, my mom owns the place. I'm just trying to get in. The woman tilted her head. I think you're mistaken, she said slowly. We bought this house last week. The sale closed Friday. Jake laughed once without humor. Number that's not? My stuff's inside. Not anymore, it's not, the woman said. Behind her, a man came into view, stockier, protective. Jake didn't like the way he looked at him. You should leave, the man said calmly, opening the door just a few inches, enough to signal authority, not an invitation. We've already called someone to confirm ownership. If you don't go, we'll call the police. Jake's voice rose. You're joking, right? I literally slept here last week. The man didn't blink. That was then. This is now. Somewhere behind the closed curtain, a phone began to ring. Jake cursed under his breath and backed off the steps, dialing Helen again. Voicemail. Again. 5 blocks away, the diner windows steamed slightly as coffee machines hissed in the background. Helen sat in her usual booth, the one near the far window that caught just enough sun to warm her left shoulder. The mug in front of her was half full. Marcy had already topped it off twice. Across from her sat a folded newspaper, untouched. Helen wasn't reading today. She was just sitting, letting the world rotate without asking her to do anything about it. Her phone buzzed softly against the table. Camera. She picked up on the second ring. The new owners love the chair, he said without preamble. They've already posted about it on their neighborhood app, said it makes the whole living room feel rooted. Helen didn't say anything at first, just smiled and stared out the window at nothing in particular. They're keeping it, Cam added. I figured, she replied softly. Marcy approached the booth with a clean pot of coffee and a curious look. She'd seen the name flash on Helen's phone. She poured, then paused. How's your Monday going? She asked. Helen wrapped both hands around the mug, lifted it slowly, and said, Better than his. Rachel's living room still smelled like eucalyptus and something lemony from the plug-in diffuser near the stairs. It had always been tidy, but tonight there was a sharpness to the order. Pillows perfectly angled, a throw folded without a single wrinkle, as if peace had to be fought for daily and measured in fabric creases. Helen sat on the edge of the couch, one leg crossed, her hands resting gently in her lap. A mug of chamomile tea cooled on the coaster beside her, untouched. Rachel sat across from her, arms tucked loosely across her stomach, her expression cautious but open. Helen had just finished telling her everything. Not the edited version, not the polite one. All of it. How Jake had called her a guest in her own home, how he'd slowly displaced her one drawer pull, one hallway photo at a time, how he took up oxygen like he was entitled to it, and how she had sold the house from under him, legally, quietly, and without apology. For a moment, Rachel didn't say anything. She leaned back against the chair, eyes cast toward the kitchen, where the dishwasher hummed softly. Then she shook her head slowly and said, I shouldn't have doubted you. Helen looked down for a moment, then smiled, but it wasn't smug, just tired. I don't blame you, she said. He's very good at sounding reasonable, right up until he isn't. Rachel let out a low breath, like she'd been holding it for 6 months. I used to tell myself it was the divorce, the stress, that he was just unraveling a little. She paused. But he was already unraveling long before we split. He just got better at hiding it. Helen finally took a sip of her tea. You still give him too much credit. Rachel gave a soft, grim chuckle. Old habits. The front door opened a few minutes later. Jake entered with his duffel bag slung over one shoulder and his laptop clutched to his chest. His clothes were wrinkled, and his expression vacillated between casual and defensive the moment he saw Helen on the couch. He dropped his bag by the door, then walked in like he wasn't late to a conversation already in motion. So, he said lightly, guess the whole house thing was a surprise for everybody. Helen didn't respond. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Jake dropped into the armchair beside the fireplace. I mean, yeah, technically it was Mom's name on the deed, but the whole selling it without telling me thing? That was kind of nuclear, don't you think? Rachel sat up straighter. Jake, don't. He lifted both hands, palms out. I'm just saying, I was blindsided. Helen pulled her phone from her purse, tapped once and turned the screen toward him. A screenshot of the deed. Her name alone. She swiped again. The closing contract, her signature, the buyers, the date. Another swipe, the email thread with Cam, detailing the timeline. She didn't say a word, just let the silence press into the fabric of the room like a slow heat. Jake glanced away. Okay, so yeah, legally, but I thought it was still my home. I didn't think you'd just do that. You called me a guest, Helen said quietly. I gave you what you wanted. Rachel stood. 2 nights, she said firmly. You can sleep on the pullout in the den, then you figure it out from there. Jake blinked. Wait, seriously? Rachel's voice was calm but unyielding. I let you stay to get your bearings, not to spiral in my house the way you did in hers. Jake looked between them like he was being set up. Neither flinched. Later that night, Helen sat in the back seat of a ride-share, headed back to her hotel. The streetlights washed across her window like slow-moving ghosts, and the driver kept the radio at a kind, low murmur. Her phone buzzed once in her coat pocket. Then again, then 4 more times. She didn't need to look to know who it was. At the hotel, she paused in the hallway before sliding the keycard through the door. She pulled her phone out and glanced at the screen. 6 unread messages from Jake, each one shorter than the last. I didn't mean it like that. You didn't have to do this. Seriously, I was just stressed. You're still my mom. Don't ignore me. Can we please just talk? Helen didn't respond. She powered the phone off completely, slipped it into the desk drawer, and poured herself another glass of the rosé. This time she didn't toast anything at all. She just sat in the stillness and let herself feel how quiet life could be when no one was taking more than their share of the air. The post office on 6th Street was quiet at that hour, too early for most errands, too late for the early crowd. Helen stood in line with a manila envelope tucked under one arm and a folded change of address form in her coat pocket. The scent of ink and cardboard hung in the air, oddly comforting. When it was her turn, she stepped up to the counter and slid the form forward. Starting today, she said. The clerk nodded, stamped something official-looking onto the top of the page, and filed it behind the glass divider. Just like that, the house on Hawthorne Lane, its mailbox, its history, its incoming bills and lingering reminders, no longer belonged to her. Helen walked out into the wind and zipped her coat to the collar. By the time she reached her hotel room, the sun had crept high enough to brush the windows in soft gold. She opened her email and scanned her messages, stopping when she saw the header from the IRS. She clicked. The tax refund had arrived. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than she'd expected, more than she'd remembered filing for. The amount was deposited into her solo account, the one Jake's name had never touched. The address it had been tied to? The North End house? The deed? Hers alone. She stared at the transaction confirmation for a long moment. Not because she doubted it, but because this was the first time in months something tangible had arrived that truly belonged to her. Later that afternoon, she had an appointment just off Warm Springs Avenue, a tidy, discreet office above a dentist's clinic. Her attorney, gray-suited, kind-eyed, and efficient, greeted her with a clipboard and a quiet smile. Helen updated everything. Her medical power of attorney, her executor, her will. Jake's name came off every document like a splinter finally worked out of skin. No fight, no hesitation, just a quiet scratch of pen over paper, each signature a little more certain than the last. She listed Rachel as her medical proxy. She left a portion of her small savings to the library where she now volunteered, and she left nothing to Jake. The attorney offered her a bottle of water and a moment of pause, but Helen declined both. She was fine. She didn't need water. She needed air. That evening, someone knocked on her hotel room door. It was Cam. He held a brown paper bag in one hand and something wrapped in newspaper under his arm. She opened the door, eyebrows lifted in amused suspicion. "This is either a favor," she said, "or a surprise." "Both," Cam replied, stepping inside. He set the bag down, take out from that Thai place on State she liked, and then gently unwrapped the newspaper bundle. Inside was a photo, framed in soft pine. It was her living room, or rather, what had once been her living room. But the photo wasn't wide. It was tight, focused only on the recliner, the light falling across its back, the hardwood glowing beneath it like a spotlight. Empty, silent, beautiful. "I asked the photographer to send me a copy," Cam said. "Didn't want to assume you'd want it, but it felt like a moment worth keeping." Helen took the frame carefully, ran her fingertips across the glass. "It was never really about the chair," she said, voice low. "I know," Cam said, "but it still made a hell of a point." She smiled at that. After he left, she placed the photo on the small desk by the window, angled toward the door. Not center stage, just there. In the morning, she mailed a copy of her change of address form to Jake. No note, no signature. Just the form, neatly folded inside a plain white envelope. Across the street, she met Marcy at the diner for their usual Wednesday breakfast. The booth was warm, the coffee freshly poured, and Marcy had already set down a slice of apple pie before Helen even ordered. "On the house," Marcy said, nudging it forward with a wink. "It's a good week for letting things go." Helen lifted her fork, nodded once, and tasted the cinnamon, rich and sharp and exactly right. She hadn't brought her phone. She didn't need to check if Jake had responded. She already knew what silence would say. Jake was staying on a friend's futon, the kind that folded with a lurch and groaned under every shift. He texted Rachel about it 3 times in 1 week, each message a slightly different variation of self-pity cloaked in sarcasm. Didn't realize guest meant exiled. Hope mom's enjoying her golden years without a conscience? It's like people forgot I was going through something too. He rotated between couches like a failed app update, never quite compatible, always lagging behind. One friend lasted 4 nights before giving excuses about house sitting. Another said his girlfriend wasn't comfortable with long-term crashers. Jake called them ungrateful. He called Helen silent. To mutual friends, he called the whole thing a misunderstanding. He said it with a chuckle, a shrug, the same way he'd once explained away losing his job, his marriage, and eventually his address. Meanwhile, Helen was shelving books. The library had become a quiet constant, 2 days a week, usually mornings, always by choice. She preferred the returns desk. There was something meditative about receiving things back in unexpected condition. Some titles returned crisp and unread, others dog-eared, spine-worn, and loved to pieces. She greeted children by name. She learned which elderly patrons preferred audiobooks. She kept a running joke with the high school volunteers about who could alphabetize the fastest. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was hers. Cam called on a Thursday afternoon with a new suggestion. "There's a condo 2 blocks from the library," he said. "It's got exposed brick, big windows, a real cook's kitchen. Might be worth a look?" Helen smiled at the image it conjured. "I'm in no rush," she said. "I figured you'd say that, but I booked a showing anyway, just in case you get curious." She didn't say no. That evening, Marcy cornered her near the coffee station at the diner. "We're starting up trivia night again," she said, nudging Helen with an elbow. "You're coming." Helen raised an eyebrow. "I don't think I've retained much trivia lately." "You remember every book title in the library by shelf number," Marcy shot back. "That counts." The team was 4 women, Helen, Marcy, a retired school counselor named Joy, and an elementary art teacher named Thea, who wore cat-eye glasses and floral scarves. They called themselves the Quiet Storm. They won by 3 points. The prize was a bottle of California Zinfandel and 4 slices of the diner's chocolate cream pie. Marcy insisted Helen take the wine. "To celebrate your criminal mastermind phase," she joked. Helen laughed, loudly, fully, the sound surprising even her. Back at the hotel, she placed the bottle next to the framed chair photo. She didn't uncork it. Not yet, but it belonged there, waiting, not looming, like a chapter ready to be written, not survived. Jake hadn't texted in 4 days. She wasn't sure if he'd finally grown tired or if his guilt had collapsed under the weight of consequence. Either way, the silence was no longer laced with anticipation. It was just silence. That weekend, she sat by the window of the library during a lull in check-ins. Outside, the sidewalk buzzed with the beginnings of a Saturday market. Laughter, music, the faint scent of kettle corn drifting through the air. Helen watched it all without envy, without urgency. She had nothing to escape from anymore. She reached into her cardigan pocket, pulled out a notepad, and scribbled a short list in tidy, looping handwriting. Call Cam back. Bring cookies next shift. Check that poetry book is back in. She paused at the bottom of the list, then wrote one more line. Buy a new chair. She didn't need it yet, but she'd earned it. The legal office smelled faintly of bergamot tea and printer toner. Not clinical, not warm, just neutral the way Helen wanted it. A space with no memory of her, no echoes of past visits or lingering conversations, only new pages. She adjusted the cuff of her cardigan as the attorney closed the door gently behind her and offered the same seat as before. Helen took it without hesitation. This won't take long, he said, smoothing a folder open across the desk. We'll review your estate plans, update your beneficiaries, and notarize the new documents. Nothing you haven't done before. Helen nodded. Good. Let's get started. The attorney turned the first page. The estate had grown, not dramatically, but enough to mean something. Between the house sale, savings, and a modest life insurance policy she hadn't thought about in years, there was something real now, something that could matter, not just sentimentally, but tangibly. What are your wishes for the residual estate? He asked. Helen didn't hesitate. I want the bulk of it donated to the Jefferson Community Center on Ash and 12th. They run after-school literacy programs. I volunteered there in the early 90s. The attorney nodded, scribbled a note. Percentage? 80. He paused, looked up. You're sure? I'm sure. The rest was easy. Rachel's name went down as her medical power of attorney, officially this time. Helen thought about how Rachel had stood next to her in the living room that night, calm, unwavering, unwilling to let Jake spin his excuses. There was no hesitation in giving her that responsibility. She had already earned it in spirit. Next came her executor, Marcy. It wasn't just about friendship. Marcy had shown up for her in all the places that mattered, with a slice of pie, a knowing glance, a well-timed question. She was the one who never pried but always saw. Helen trusted her more than anyone to tie up loose ends when she no longer could. And finally, Jake. The attorney cleared his throat delicately as he reached that part of the form. Do you want to list him anywhere under secondary inheritance or contingent designations? Helen shook her head once. No. Would you like a letter of explanation on file in case he contests? No, she said again, her voice steady. There's nothing to explain. He had what mattered, and he didn't want it. The attorney looked at her for a long moment, perhaps searching for grief or anger or maybe regret. But Helen offered none, only a calm resolve that had taken a year to sharpen into shape. By the time she slid her final signature across the line, her hand didn't tremble, not even slightly. They walked out into the hallway together. The November sky was pale with cloud cover, and the wind had picked up again, tugging at the edges of her coat. It smelled faintly of snow, though nothing had fallen yet. Outside, she paused on the sidewalk. She didn't need a ride. She didn't feel tired. She felt clean, lighter, not free in the cinematic sense, just uncluttered. She walked 2 blocks to the diner, not because she was hungry, but because she wanted to see something familiar. Marcy was behind the counter, wiping down menus. When she saw Helen, she smiled in that crooked way of hers, eyes soft beneath the overhead fluorescence. Need caffeine or closure? She asked. Helen slid onto the stool. Neither, just company. Marcy poured the coffee anyway. You've got that look, she said. What look? The kind of look people get when they've finally taken themselves off someone else's hook. Helen stirred cream into her mug, slowly. It's a good look then. It is, Marcy said. You wear it well. They didn't speak for a while. Outside, a young boy zipped past the diner window on a scooter, scarf trailing behind him like a flag. The street was lined with damp leaves. The wind shook loose another gust, and Helen pulled her coat tighter around her. Back in her hotel room, later that evening, she pulled out her notepad and made a small addition to her running list. Below the line that read, "Buy a new chair," she wrote, "Visit community center on Monday." Then she drew a neat, careful line beneath it. For the first time, it felt like she was writing not just a list, but a will. Monday came with a promise of snow that never arrived, just low clouds, the smell of cedar mulch, and that cold, damp kind of Boise air that crept past collars and settled in the joints. Helen zipped her coat to the top and stepped off the bus at Ash and 12th. The Jefferson Community Center looked exactly as she remembered it, red brick trimmed in tan, windows fogged at the edges, and a handmade wreath hung slightly crooked on the front door. Someone had propped it open with a brick. Inside, the air smelled like crayons, old carpeting, and institutional coffee, but underneath that, it smelled like childhood, like possibility. "Ms. Carver?" a voice called, already rounding the corner from the main hallway. A woman in her 30s approached, navy cardigan, chunky boots, clipboard in hand, warmth radiating in every step. "I'm Trina," she said, breath slightly short from the rush. "Director here. We are so honored you came." Helen smiled. "I was overdue." They shook hands, then walked together through the hallway, voices hushed despite the distant laughter of children echoing from the multi-purpose room. Trina led her into the reading lounge, what used to be a quiet little alcove tucked behind the admin offices. Now it had been repainted in soft green, lit by 2 large windows and lined wall to wall with low shelves and beanbags. A fireplace screen glowed electric orange in the corner, and just above the archway, freshly mounted on the wall, the Helen Carver Literacy Room, etched in clean bronze, simple serif font. Helen stood still, reading it twice, not because she didn't believe it, but because it felt so much quieter than she thought Legacy would feel. "I hope the name's all right," Trina said gently. "It's more than all right," Helen replied. "Thank you." Trina gestured toward a small cart in the corner. "And thank you for these. I understand these were your husband's?" Helen nodded and stepped forward. The books were worn at the edges but intact. Dickens, Baldwin, Atwood, Vonnegut. Some annotated, some not. Her fingers grazed the margin notes in Richard's slanted script. A part of her had worried it would feel like theft to give them away, but standing here, surrounded by the buzz of voices outside the door, she realized she'd just returned them to circulation, the way he would have wanted. Just then the front door jingled faintly. Cam appeared in the entryway holding 2 lattes from a nearby cafe, one black, one already sweetened the way she liked it. "Did I miss the ribbon cutting?" he said, mock scandalized. Helen chuckled. "Just in time for the quiet part." He handed her the latte with a wink. "For the woman who read her way out of a corner." She took the cup, warmth soaking into her fingers. "I had a good realtor." He smiled but didn't respond. Some victories didn't need applause. As they turned toward the exit, Helen saw Marcy walking in through the main hallway, cheeks flushed from the wind, carrying a tote bag and a tin of homemade cookies. "Oh, for crying out loud," Helen said, half laughing. "What?" Marcy asked, blinking with feigned innocence. "Can't a woman bring baked goods to a room named after her best friend?" The hug came naturally, no build-up, no grand statement, just arms around shoulders, firm and real. When Marcy stepped back, her eyes were wet. "I'm just proud of you, that's all," she whispered. "You wrote the ending yourself." Helen didn't speak. She only nodded once. That was enough. That night, back at the hotel, Helen found a letter slipped under her door. No return address. But the handwriting was Rachel's. She sat by the desk lamp and unfolded the single sheet of thick stationery. "Helen, I know you didn't ask for this. I know you didn't need it, but I wanted you to have it anyway. Thank you for reminding me what boundaries look like, for reminding me that strength doesn't always have to be loud, for showing me that love can be firm without being cruel, and that sometimes protecting your peace is the most generous thing you can do for the people around you. I see you, I honor you, and I hope, someday, Jake will too. But even if he doesn't, that doesn't change a thing. With love, Rachel. Helen read it twice, then folded it gently and tucked it into her notebook behind the page that still read, "Buy a new chair." She stared at that line for a long time, then added one more beneath it. "Find a place worth sitting still in." She didn't know where yet, but she would. And it wouldn't include explaining herself to anyone who hadn't already listened. The wind off the Portland coastline didn't ask permission. It greeted Helen like an old friend, noisy, honest, and bracingly cold. She zipped her coat to the chin and walked just close enough to the water's edge that the soles of her boots left crisp impressions in damp sand. Waves rolled in with a rhythm older than guilt. Salt clung to the air, her cheeks pinked with wind, but she didn't rush. This wasn't the kind of walk taken for exercise, it was the kind taken for breath. She'd rented the cottage on a whim, a clapboard place with faded blue shutters and hydrangeas leaning against the porch rail. One bedroom, a narrow kitchen, a loft with a window seat big enough for knees and a paperback. For the first time in years, Helen wasn't checking her phone. She wasn't checking out of a hotel or checking in with anyone. No itinerary, no explanations. Just a week by the sea with nothing but books, quiet, and a town where no one knew her name. She spent the mornings reading, the afternoons walking, and the evenings in the corner of the cottage with a throw blanket and a mug of peppermint tea. The bookshelf by the fireplace held second-hand novels, most with inscriptions from people she'd never meet. To Cam, she'd sent a short text, "Safe. Here. Don't call unless it's hilarious." He'd replied with a selfie of himself wearing a just-listed beanie and a thumbs up. Rachel got a postcard, a watercolor of the coastline, and a few lines in Helen's now familiar looping script. "Still figuring out where I'll land. But the view is good in the meantime." Marcy's postcard was less poetic. "Found a pie shop that rivals yours. Don't be mad. I only said rival." She'd drawn a doodle of a slice and labeled it "Respectfully Second Place." Midweek, she found it. A store tucked beside a harbor cafe, unassuming except for the row of worn, mismatched furniture lined up outside like soldiers at ease. Inside, the scent was wood polish and old fabric, faintly marine, slightly floral. The woman behind the counter had sea-gray hair and a paperback tucked beneath her elbow. Helen took her time. No replicas, no fast assembly, just furniture with corners softened by life. Then, in the far corner, she saw it. A high-backed armchair in slate blue velvet, curved just slightly at the arms, with brass stud detailing along the edges. The cushion had give, but not too much. It was sturdy, reliable, inviting but no longer demanding to be claimed. She sat down. The chair didn't whisper anything to her, but it held her. Later that evening, the receipt folded in her pocket and delivery scheduled for the following month, she returned to the cottage and opened the windows just wide enough to hear the tide. She made herself a small dinner, grilled cheese with heirloom tomatoes, a glass of chilled Chardonnay, and read a few chapters of a weather-worn mystery she found in the loft. Just after 9, her phone rang. She nearly let it go to voicemail, but the number on the screen was the community center. She answered, curling her toes into the rug. "Ms. Carver?" said Trina, her voice warm with that faint buzz of someone who's been talking to children all day. "We didn't want to wait till you were home to tell you. One of the little girls who uses the reading room wrote her first sentence today. She picked one of your husband's books off the shelf and said, 'This one smells like someone who believed in me.'" Helen blinked hard and pressed her palm to her chest. "We just wanted you to know." "Thank you," Helen said softly, "for telling me." After they hung up, she sat by the open window for a long time, watching the moon stretch itself across the water like something slowly learning how to be full again. The cottage was quiet, but it wasn't empty. Tomorrow, she'd write one more postcard. And next week, she'd return to Boise, meet with Cam, maybe view that condo with the brick walls and the tall windows. Or maybe not. There was no rush. She stepped back inside and picked up her notepad from the counter. Below the line that read, "Find a place worth sitting still in," she added, "Remember what it feels like to move just because you want to." Then she smiled, because she had, and she would again. She walked to the fireplace, set down her tea, and sank slowly into the old loaner chair that came with the cottage. It wasn't hers. It didn't have to be, because some chairs weren't meant to be kept forever. Some were just meant to teach you how to sit still again. She closed her eyes, let the sea wind rattle the window panes, and exhaled a final truth she didn't need to say out loud. Turns out I didn't need the chair, I just needed the keys.